Should be coming up now.
Always takes a second or two. This is us. Good afternoon. Wait for the people who are joining us online. We still have about a minute to go before we actually fully get started, but I wanted to make sure that everything went fine. I don't have any of the out of focus problems that I had a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon to those of you who are joining us slowly but surely online. Everybody should be inside today because if you live anywhere from essentially Michigan all the way over to the East Coast, it's not safe out there for air quality because of the forest fires that are raging all over eastern Canada, it seems like. So it's a good day to be inside and participating in Bible study, although I will say all of the smell when you walk outside and you can smell a little bit of that kind of that burning sensation or that smell of something's burning works really well with the book of Revelation. That seems to fit just perfectly with what we're doing. And you're thinking, well, that seems a little much to do all that. All right. So, today we're looking at chapters 12, 13, and 14. And chapter 12, the whole thing is just yet another great example of John using imagery to kind of get our attention. But what's really interesting is that chapter 12 is a really good example of John using narratives that everybody knew really well and then kind of turning them on their head just a little bit. He knows that they know this story. He knows that they are going to be able to figure out exactly what he's really talking about, but he's going to use these symbols. He's going to use this imagery in a way to get it to land differently. If he just tells the same old story, if he just uses the references that are directly from, especially the Gospels in this particular case, people would be like, oh yeah, I already know this, right? It's one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, I know this story. And as soon as we think that we know what the story is, we don't pay attention as closely. And so this is a story, chapter 12 is a story that we know really well. In fact, this story is the centerpiece for one of the three major festivals in the church year, right? This is all about the festival of the Incarnation and its immediate aftermath, i.e. Christmas. Chapter 12 is, in many ways, a retelling of the story of the birth of Jesus and then his subsequent flight into Egypt to escape Herod, right? And you're thinking, and yeah, that's right. Herod is the dragon, or represents, or symbolizes, right? And so But instead of that very earthbound narrative, Jesus being born in the stable in Bethlehem and shepherds and angels, although think about even that. Even then, the story has this kind of kaleidoscopic, kind of big imagery kind of sense to it. I mean, you get angels singing from the heavens in the original narrative. But in this particular case, he puts a different spin on it, and he also takes images from the Old Testament, from Babylonian, Persian, Egyptian, and even Greek mythology. And of course, the question is, why? Why does he take what is a story that would have been very straightforward to them, the birth narrative of Jesus, although at this time, Christmas isn't a thing yet. They're not celebrating Christmas in the same way as we do today. That's a later addition. But the story of the incarnation is clear throughout all of Luke. It's in the Gospels. And so this is a story that they would have known. But he just takes it and he moves it from its earthbound narrative into this big, grand, celestial thing. And the question is, why use that narrative device? Why take a story that's really well known and then just kind of blow it up into this much bigger thing? And the answer is really not that hard, because they're going to pay attention to it in a different way. And he's going to highlight some bits and pieces along the way that are really important. And so think of it this way. One of the first words that we get that makes us kind of sit up and take notice in chapter 12 is that John says that there's a portent, right? And this is not a word that we use all that often in our everyday language. What is a portent? What do you think that means? Jack, you want to guess?
Oh, a situation.
Yeah, situation, perhaps, of great importance.
Yeah, something that is attention getting.
Yeah, attention getting. Think of it as a sign. Maybe a way to think about it is, in the old kind of terminology, a wonder. It is clearly something different than just your basic, hey, you should pay attention to this. This is something of cosmic significance. There is something deeply, profoundly important that everybody should be paying attention to. It's the kind of thing that I remember I used to do especially in my 745 class when I was teaching. I had an introduction to American history at 7:45 in the morning. And yeah, I mean, it was rough. It was rough on them. It was rough on me. And every now and then, I would randomly clap really loud when I was making a point. And they'd be like, what? Was that really important? I'm like, no, but you're now awake. Right? And they would get very annoyed with me. And then when I would clap at other times, or snap or something like that, or raise my voice or something like that, is this really important, or are you just trying to get our attention? And I would always say, both. Yeah, that's the point. It's the point of me trying to get your attention. I think this is so important that I'm going to do something extraordinary to make sure that you're paying attention.
And so now you think about it, that's the other part of import.
Yeah, right. Yeah, portent, right? So there's this, you now know that there's something big that is going to happen. And this portent begins this new series of visions, right? They say, okay, this big thing's going to happen. You're like, okay, what? Because one of the things that John has essentially taught us in these first 11 chapters is that when he rolls out a new vision, we're like, oh, we better pay attention. Because that's what we're not sure if he's kind of peeling back and talking about something new or something old in a new way, or if he's trotting out something new as he's moving the storyline along. And so this, by him saying, "Oh, there's a new portent in the heavens," we're like, oh, okay, what? And it does exactly what he wants, which is to get our attention. Okay, our attention is now securely gotten, and what we get is the woman clothed with the sun, right? And she has the 12 stars and all this kind of stuff, and you're thinking, okay, this is a new character. And then we get another new character. We get a giant red dragon, right? That's so big that even though it's hunched down, it sweeps its tail and dislodges a third of the stars and sends them falling to earth. That's a big dragon, right? And so we get these new characters. So we clearly here we have the good character, and now we have a very evil character, and now it's just a matter of, okay, now what's going to happen? You've introduced these new characters. What do we get? And what we get is the dragon standing before the woman to devour the child that she's about to deliver. And all of a sudden you think is, yikes, glah. What's that? Why doesn't he just eat her? Yeah, Rosa, it's a good question. It's one of those things. But again, there's a really good answer. It doesn't fit John's narrative, right? Because John's got, this is one of those things that goes back to what Dr. Metzger said. It doesn't mean what it says, it means what it means. And in this particular case, we can try to figure out, why doesn't the dragon do that? And John would be like, because he doesn't. Okay, just move on. Because that's not the point of the story. The point of the story isn't for it to make a linear narrative sense. That's not the point. The point is to get you thinking about the big stuff that John wants you to think about. And so what does all this mean? Good Lutheran question, right? What does this mean? Well, we can start figuring things out because this is the way that John has kind of set the stage for us already. The first is, clearly the dragon is the devil or Satan, right? And we could probably figure out just as comfortably that, at least in one way of thinking about it, the child to be born is Jesus, right? I think we can figure that out, right? Now, here's the interesting thing, though, is that John, being a product of Asia Minor and Greece and that whole part of the Mediterranean, he would have not only have had all the Jewish kind of mythological creatures in his back pocket. We're going to get creatures that sound familiar to Daniel and other places like that. And then he's got the New Testament, very well in hand. This guy's probably really well read. He's probably a bit of a scholar in his own right. So he probably even knows there's a wonderful Greek myth that has a story that's very similar to this. Because in the Greek myth, there's the goddess Leto. She's pregnant, and she is pursued by a dragon named Python, right? And Python, the dragon, wants to kill the child because he knows that the child, if it is born, will destroy him. Well, Poseidon, the god of the sea, rescues Leto, and lo and behold, she gives birth to the god Apollo, and Apollo does in fact kill the dragon. So the story was all nice and tidy. And so as he's telling this, they're going to be like, oh, okay, but here's the thing. By this point, pretty much nobody believed in the Greek gods and goddesses. They saw them as myths and stories, but they always saw them as these, a myth is not so much a lie as what I would call it as a foundational story, right? It says something true about who we are and how we have come to be and how we're supposed to act, but it may not be 100% factually accurate, right? And I think we can pretty much agree that the Greek myths are not factually accurate, right? But he would have used that, and he would have tipped his hat to those stories because he would have known that everybody would have known those. Those are the stories that you tell around the campfire or just to your kids or something like that. They're from a common source of stories. Today we would use superheroes or other things like that, or people from American history, good or bad, right? Heroes or villains. And whether they actually did the thing or not is less to the point of the kind of symbolic point that you're trying to make. But in both cases, John knows his audience so well, and he's just going to assume safely that they're going to catch all of his references. And I've mentioned this a couple times, but I think it's particularly important to go back to is that sometimes the only thing that really trips us up with reading the book of Revelation is that we don't live in the first century. And we don't live in the Eastern Mediterranean world. We don't have that common storehouse of fables and stories and myths and other things like that. We don't have that collection where we go, oh yeah, that's what it is. We wouldn't even think twice about it. That's what John's doing. He knows he can mess with these stories because everybody's going to be like, they're going to be right with him. They're not going to have to work hard. They're not going to really sweat this. They're not going to have to sort it out. And they're not going to do what a lot of people do with the book of Revelation, say, aha, it actually means this. No, it really doesn't. It just means that, right? It means what it means. And they would have understood that. And just 2,000 years of distance and time makes it hard for us. And so that's what's going on. All right. So it's Jesus, and then Mary, it's Leto and Apollo, it's all these kind of things kind of mishmashed together. But the point of it is that the dragon's going to fail. The evil one will fail. That the power, no matter what it is, that's arrayed against God, doesn't have a prayer of winning. And that's really important because a lot of our interpretation of the book of Revelation in the modern period, especially in the 20th and 21st century, always says, oh, there's going to be this tremendous cataclysmic battle between God and the devil. And what John is saying is that it's not really a competition. I mean, it's going to be terrible, right? But guess what? Newsflash, spoiler alert, God wins. Period. That's the end of the story. That's what John really wants us to get. So the dragon's eagerness to devour the child, well, it explains a couple of things all at the same time. The violent opposition that Jesus met during his earthly ministry, right? Notice that people were always trying to kill him or run him off, and then they ultimately did, right? But again, even death for Jesus isn't the end of the story, right? But starting with Herod, right? Do you remember what Herod did in his mad quest to get... Yeah, killed all the baby boys, right? Under the age of 2, slaughtering the innocents. And so in his mad desire to get rid of what he thinks is going to be a rival to his power. But of course, what is really important for us to understand is that Jesus' power is not earthly power, right? Jesus, his conquest isn't the way we think about it. But Herod and others, that's what they're always worried about. They're worried about getting kicked out of power. They're not thinking about what Jesus really means when he's talking about power, what Jesus means when he's talking about conquest. And so they're always reacting so negatively because they don't understand. All right, so Herod, is represented by the dragon, and of course, in every case, Satan is thwarted. The child is snatched away and taken to God, which is a really good way of saying, okay, the ascension. Yeah, Jesus ascends into heaven. And you're like, oh, well, that's the story. Now, that takes some of the fun out of it, because now we're not trying to manipulate current history into saying, well, who's the dragon and who's the woman and all this kind of stuff. When John comes right out and tells you, well, it's that, right? It is what it is. And it's not a mystery to them because they would have known the story. And in this particular case, this one's really easy because we should be able to spot that, a mile away. Wait, a woman clothed with the sun coming down out of heaven? Who could that possibly be? And she's pregnant and she's going to give birth. It shouldn't be that hard, right? But what we've done, I think, is really important because it no longer feels as hard because we've started to unpack it. We've started to explain the symbols a little bit by giving them back to John, right? John's a good storyteller. This is a good story, and it's being told to a particular audience at a particular time. And once we keep those things in the back of our mind, the rest of it starts to fill out very nicely, right? This is just the gospel story condensed, right? And the woman can be seen both as Mary or the ideal of community of God's people. First, in its Jewish form, in which Mary gives birth to the Messiah, and then in its Christian form, in which the church was persecuted by a political power as evil as the dragon, right? Because for John, remember, dragon is Rome, or the beast is Rome. Rome's the bad guy. We always have to keep in our minds that for John, there's no worse, antagonist out there than Rome and the emperor and the power of Rome and the oppressiveness of Rome. All of that, the church is being persecuted. It's really not a stretch to figure out what's going on. But the other thing too, and this is a good thing, it does still resonate in our lives. Not because there's a great power out there persecuting Christians, but because it says to us that even no matter what situation we are in, perseverance, right, is vital, and sticking to what God has called us to do. Our day and age, the problem isn't that we're being persecuted, is that we're just that a lot of people have just faded away from the church. Well, guess what? They still need direction, right? And that means that we still need to be here to give them direction. And so our perseverance is going to look different than first century perseverance, but it's perseverance in the faith nonetheless, right? All right. Then the story changes, and now we get the fight between the dragon and Michael and all the angels, right? This is just a good representation of the church as the new people of God. Michael can also be seen as representing the atoning death of Christ and the preaching of the gospel. How do you beat the adversary? By telling the story, by living the life, by showing faith in all that you do. It's not complicated, and it's not warfare in the sense that the world thinks about it. It's conquest, and that term that we keep using, in a different way of thinking about it, right? Closing verses of chapter 12 are clear depictions that the dragon is going to start to inflict great harm on the other children of the woman. And this is where some people say, see, this isn't Mary at all. But sure it is, because Mary's son, right, and everybody else then is going to be following in those footsteps. It's the Christians who actually obey God and bear testimony to Jesus. Those are the people who are really in the soup at that particular moment. It's, Jesus and the disciples are a story that's, back then, Jesus has ascended. The disciples are, they were 2-3 generations ago. It's us. It's in the, who are in the midst of this conflict now, especially in the first century. And so John is explaining, in many ways, the origin of the persecutions of his audience that they're experiencing. Does he use big, wild, symbolic imagery to get you there? Yeah, he does. You know what, though? We'll remember it. It sticks with us because the vision is so distinct. It's so out there, right? It's the kind of thing that, you eat pepperoni pizza too late and it gives you indigestion, and then you can't sleep, and this is the kind of stuff that you have in your head, right? It's just, it's wild, it's out there, but we always know what it points back to, right? Symbols point to something, right? And John's book is the greatest collection of poetic symbolism in condensed form that we've ever had. But he's always pointing to the same things. He's always trying to get us to think about what's important and how this all fits together. Which leads us nicely into chapter 13. Because chapter 13 is when we start to get we get the dragon, we get the beast from the sea, and we get the beast from the earth, right? Now, most writers will tell you, right, interpreters and stuff like that, that this is essentially a perversion of the Trinity. In fact, they will also, some writers will often call this the satanic Trinity, right? It takes the Trinity and perverts them, inverts them, shows what their opposite might actually be. But really, it's just a nice, or it's a visual and visually grabbing kind of image to get you to see how, what the opposite would look like, And that's the other thing, is that the dragon, the beasts, they're always about destruction and tearing everything apart and killing and murder and blood and all the rest. And it's helpful to remind yourself that that means that God is not those things, right? That doesn't, this is the other side of that, right?
But he's saying that, like he's surprised that after all of this so far, the whole world is following the beast.
Right. And there's, if John has a prophetic point to make, it's not unlike the prophetic points that the Old Testament prophets were. And that is, that the dragon is bad news. You know that the beast is bad news. And yet, there you are, still following. Still following. That's the problem, right? That's the thing that John is, he's pointing it out. And so, maybe in this case, it's, maybe if I make the monsters monstrous enough, people will recognize, don't follow them. But we know that that's not true. We can make them as monstrous as possible, and people are like, well, it might give me money and power and glory and fame and all the other kind of thing. And it's like, but that's not the way it works. And they're like, well, but it could this time, right? Yeah. And the situation is, that's really what John wants people to take away from all of this, is part of the perseverance means resisting the temptation to follow the beast or the dragon or any of this. They know, right? And so he depicts the dragon. The dragon is red, which is a good visual image of blood or murder. It's got 7 heads, which are like, oh, wait a minute, 7. Yeah, but also it means it has a lot of power, right? John's not saying that the dragon isn't dangerous. It is. And for us especially, right? God's got full control over it, but that doesn't mean that we do. Right? God's got the power to directly confront the dragon. This is not a contest. But we have all sorts of, we don't have the power to directly confront it. So John is saying that it's dangerous for us. It's not dangerous for God. This is not a thing. But it's dangerous for us. And so 7 heads means the beast or the dragon's got a lot of power. There are 10 horns on this dragon, which is, frankly, a throwback to Daniel's 4th beast, right? He had 10 horns. But unlike in Daniel, we're not dealing with a succession of empires. We're just showing that the power arrayed against the nascent church is massive. That Rome is a real threat, right? And so this is his way of saying, but even though there's this power arrayed against you, stick with it, right? This is the right thing. This is the right path. Yes, it's frightening, it's scary, it's dangerous, but you're doing the right thing. You're on the right side of all of this. So if the dragon is Satan in this particular case, in this satanic trinity. The beast from the sea is Rome, right? It's the idolatry of emperor worship. And John will always be going against that, right? If our job as Christians is to stick with it in the face of everything, the biggest problem that we are confronting is the idolatry of emperor worship. You're worshiping the wrong God. That guy is all about the beast's power, death, destruction, oppression. You are never going to get to the kingdom of God by listening to the emperor. And that makes perfect sense to us. But it still has to be a point that needs to be made repeatedly because, amazingly enough, we're forgetful, you know.
And the beast, well, he'll be so deceitful.
Right.
I remember once I was sharing with someone that I had asked God for something, I've been asking God for something, and it showed up in the form of a person that sounded like it was exactly like what I had asked for, and the person, and then it turned out to not be.
Mm-hmm.
And the person told me, she says, well, you know, when you're asking God, Satan is listening as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, just because something shows up doesn't mean that it necessarily came from God.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that it necessarily came from God. And we tend to think that, though, because we think, though, it's just you and me, God, we're all good, and nobody else is paying attention. Right, exactly right. And so that's why John continually reinforces this, right? He's constantly saying, no, don't, right? You know, that the devil is bad, the dragon is bad, but the beast from the sea, which is Rome, just as bad. This is not going to get you anywhere that you want to go. This is not positive. And worshiping the emperor is bad news, right? Because he's only concerned with power and the way that people have always thought about conquest. He's not concerned about what Jesus has taught us, right? Which is to love and mercy and justice and peace, right? And so this emperor worship, the power of Rome in persecuting Christians, there's an interesting thing. Not every emperor was really all that enthusiastic about promulgating emperor worship. There's some of them are like, no, I'm not divine. I mean, if you want to believe that's great, but he didn't spend a lot of time promoting that. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't being promoted anyway, mostly by local officials. Why would local officials be so engaged in promoting the cult of emperor worship, do you think? Yeah, maybe it's because they were trying to show their allegiance to the emperor, but
That would grant them some kind of power.
well, yeah, it would grant them some kind of power. The other thing, too, is that if they're the ones promoting the emperor worship cult and propping up the emperor, doesn't matter. The emperor never has to show up because they've got their people all in line, right? It's a great way to control the local population. If the local guy is saying, oh, you've got to do this all the time because the emperor is going to be angry, all of a sudden it's like that, you know, that authority figure that never has to show up, but all you have to do is use it as a threat, right, to keep the local population in line. And so the local and regional governors are going to be like, oh, absolutely, emperor worship, it's a great way to go. And this is likely who John was referencing as the beast that rises from the earth, are all these local officials, because these are the people who are really concerned about keeping the population in line. That's the best way to maintain the peace, they think, is to crush everybody so that they're afraid of what might happen. All right. And then this beast that rises from the earth, is a bit of a grim parody of the Lamb of God. It's got two horns like a lamb, but it speaks like the dragon, right? And so it looks right. And Jackie, that goes right back to what you were saying. Well, it looked right, but it sounded all wrong, right? You know, it was, and so we've got to be careful about that, you know, that some things may, you know, it's always the phrase, if it sounds too good to be true, maybe you should, you know, think about that. And so John is encouraging his people, right? And the people who are reading this, the book of Revelation, say, okay, careful now. And this was especially the case because there's that whole next section in the chapter that talks about buying and selling, right? That the best way, yeah, right, Gwen, she was just mentioning you control and then you profit. And that's exactly the way to think about it. Yeah, so yeah, very astute. Is that the buying and selling part comes from this. The best way to impress people was by, the medium of exchange were coins in the Roman Empire. Well, the best way to impress people is to put the Roman emperor's face on the coins, right? Even Jesus says, you know, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, right? Every transaction means of buying and selling, which is just, well, life, involves the transfer of money, which meant that you had to handle imperial coins, right? And so the mark of the beast, as it were, are the coins that you carry around in your pocket because you've got to use them, which puts the Christians into a really sticky situation. How do you participate in the Roman economy and not tacitly participate in emperor worship when you use Roman coins, right? And so it's really speaking to a very concrete, you know, economic problem that the Christians were like, well, you know, because likely it's not their, you know, these are coins that were exchanged at the temples or at the various places of sacrifice or the altars. And it gets all very messy. You know, how do you live your life as a good Christian without being, you know, essentially dragged into the worship of idols? And that's a tough nut. It is a tough nut. Yeah, you need that to do anything, right?
You need the coins to, like the guy on the gospel channel said yesterday, you need the coins in order to, the church to do God's work.
Right, yes. Yeah, I mean, we have to take in offerings to do the things, and they had to take in offerings to take care of the people just like we did. Right, and so what do you do then? And so it's tipping his hat to the understanding and his acknowledgement that, yeah, this is hard. But the question then is there a way to do this without giving yourself to the emperor or to the emperor's power? Can you find a way through that particular labyrinth? And that's hard. All right. And he doesn't really say anything, you know, he just throws it out there as a real concern and that, yeah. And so, okay, you may have to use that, but don't give yourself over to it. Don't give in, like the people of Laodicea who said, well, maybe we can split the difference between being good Christians and worshiping the emperor. And John's like, no, that's not the way it works, right? And so these are reminders. Remember, think about those 7 letters to the churches, and now he's saying, okay, you remember those things? Yeah, don't do them. Those were really straightforward. Now he's putting this big symbolic wild imagery on it. So you're not just participating in an economy in the bad way. This is actually the mark of the beast. And you're like, oh, okay. But that should make you aware that you've got to be really careful. All right. Which then leads us to one of the great numerological bits in all of human writing, and that's the number of the beast, which is 666. Now, by this point, see, this is going to be awesome. By this point, you should be able to sort out what the number actually means without knowing anything about Jewish or early Christian numerology, and we'll get there in just a second. It's really not all that hard. What do you think that number actually means? Yeah. It means, think of what is the number that John uses as his favorite sacred number? It means wholeness, completeness, all the rest. The number 7. So what is the number 6? It's imperfect. And now we're going to repeat that 3 times, right? For the dragon, the beast from the sea, the beast. He repeats it 3 times. It's the sacred number 7 minus 1 repeated 3 times. It's the ultimate symbol of imperfection. Falling short. Not complete, not whole. It's just not. Right? Now, John, if he had just said that number, we would have been walking away from it and going, oh, it just means ultimate symbol of imperfection. But then he throws the whole thing into the deep end of speculation, and I want to go back and kind of ask him about that, because John throws the whole thing and says, the number is actually a person's name. And now you've just, all the conspiracy theorists in the world are like, ha ha ha, see, I knew it. It's not just this symbolic number, there's somebody attached to it. But it's really not that hard. It's really not that hard. In both the Greek and the Hebrew alphabets, the numbers or the letters also serve as numerals. So alpha would be 1, beta 2, right? And you can do that in the aleph and all the rest in Hebrew as well. It's a well-known technique then of that day to add up the letters in a name to give you a number. And so, for example, my first name is Ken. You take the 3 letters, 11 plus 5 plus 14. And so my first name would be 30. Isn't that exciting? And you're thinking, but that's really dull. Correct, it is. But that's just, I know, I am the no fun brigade for all of this. My whole job is just to say to everybody, you know that thing that everybody gets all excited about? Really done. It's really not that big of a deal. So who is it, right? Emperor Nero. Neron Caesar gets us to 666. In some books, some translations, the number is actually 616, right? You may have actually seen that in some interpretation, some translation. Okay, it works the same way, just sometimes you don't spell it with the N. And when you do Nero Caesar, you get 616. So it's Emperor Nero. It's just Nero. And you're thinking, well, why Nero? Well, Nero was terrible. He was a terrible emperor, and he was terrible to Christians. Nero nearly burned down all of Rome. And he did this because he wanted to get rid of some parts of Rome so that he could build new things in honor of himself. Well, yeah, he was trying to get rid of, in this case, he was trying to get rid of older temples and stuff like that. And so he had his very, very talented people set fire to certain parts of the city. It was going to be a controlled burn. Nearly burns down all of Rome. What does Nero then turn around right away and do? It was the Christians' fault, right? So he throws the Christians under the bus so far that people are like, oh, it's always the Christians. I mean, all the way to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, this book that was written, and I'm trying to remember, and all my historian friends are like, you've forgotten, that the decline and fall of the Roman Empire actually believes, essentially, Nero, and blames the decline and fall of the Roman Empire on Christians, right? No, that didn't happen. Nero nearly burned his own city down, blamed the Christians, and so, yeah, do the Christians, are they a little sore about this afterwards? Yes. Does that mean that John then tags Nero with the number of the beast? Yes, he does. Because he's emblematic, he's symbolic of the power arrayed against the nation Christians. And frankly, he was just terrible. He was a terrible human being. Nobody looks back and says, Nero, what a swell guy. All right? He does have a bad reputation. He has a particularly bad reputation with the Christians in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And so if they were going to tag, anybody with somebody who was carrying around the number of the beast, it was going to be him. This is not a mystery. This is pretty straightforward. All right. So, following this whole perversion of the Trinity, we get another break, right? And this is a literary choice that John makes pretty frequently. We get these scenes of great terror, great horror, and then he steps out of the dread and reminds the reader of hope and security, a way through, not a way out of, right? John is never going to suggest that the Christians are going to be able to dodge all of this nonsense, that it's going to be bad, but the good Christians are going to be the ones who wade through it, right? And that the Lamb is going to be the one who guides them through it. And so the opening of chapter 14 is one of those interludes that John likes to use. Because notice what he's doing. He ratchets up all this tension, this horror, and then he gives you a chance to catch your breath. It's like, okay, it's all bad. But it's not all bad. There's going to be these times when the good guys win this fight. And he needs to remind us of this because this is a whole torrent of bad things happening, right? We can look at this and go, we got no hope. And John's like, oh, but you do. And so now we get the Lamb on Mount Zion. The faithful are there. The sounds are now of peace and worship and the voice from the heavens. And this is one of those occasions where John says something that would have made perfect sense to them and that we really trip up on because he's going to start talking about the faithful who are around the throne and around in heaven, and he's going to talk about how the people who are there are going to be virgins, right? Never been with a woman, all this kind of stuff. And I want to be very careful here because a lot of damage has been done by people getting what John's writing here in the 14th chapter, in this particular section, getting it really wrong, right? John is not making a case for sexual purity. He's not even really making a case against sexual immorality, right? But the virgins are described as those who follow the Lamb wherever he goes, right? But let me ask you a question. Up to this point, has John ever been kind of fulminating against sexual perversion or sexual immorality or actually anything having to do with sex? He hasn't been, right? And this is one of those things. He's always been talking about infidelity, yes, but infidelity to God, right? He's talking about chasing off after other gods, giving yourself over to other gods, and that is emperor worship. And so he's just saying, don't do that, right? He's not talking about virginity in the sense of sexual purity or sexual abstinence, or he's not even, he's got much bigger fish to fry than sexual immorality. That's not his concern. And there's another thing that's going on here that's really, really very important. We have to remember that John has already established what his images mean. He's talked about this kind of stuff before, and he's always talking about our lack of faithfulness to God. Not our lack of faithfulness to our spouse, right, or anything else like that. He's not talking about that at all. Because something that's really important here, and we're going to get this in the next section too, John has always been talking using poetic symbolism, yeah? Why all of a sudden are we treating his words literally? Because that's what you have to do. In order to all of a sudden say, oh, John's talking about sexual perversion or sexual immorality, you have to say to yourself, but he's never been talking about these things in any other way than symbolic, but now he's all of a sudden not using symbolic language? Of course he is. John is remarkably consistent. You know what John's upset about? People traipsing off after other gods. Don't do it. Remain steadfast, remain pure, but not pure about your human relationships, but your purity in your relationship with God. Remain faithful to God, because here's the thing, God is always faithful to us. God's not chasing off after John. God doesn't give up on us. And so, what is his beginning and ending of his prophetic warning? Don't be unfaithful to God. No emperor worship. None of that. All right. So, but that's really important. It's just spectacularly important that anytime any of that language is used, we go, wait a minute, our antenna are up. We know what he's talking about, because it's like, we've heard it before. He's not going to change midstream, right? He's not going to all of a sudden say, oh no, wait, I'm talking about this. You haven't been talking about that the whole time. You don't care about that. Well, he probably does care about that, but that's not the thing that he's concerned about.
Does he say is he 7? Is he screaming?
Yeah.
Fear God.
Yeah.
Give him all the glory.
Yep. Yeah. And that's just a reminder to us, like, oh, okay, yeah, no, I get it, because we may have forgotten, and John's like, please don't forget. Yep. Yeah. Fear God, give him the glory, for the hour of his judgment has come. And because now it's like, okay, maybe you weren't paying attention, but let's ratchet the tension back up again. We took this little breather. That was very nice. Whew, we all feel like this is going to be good, but I'm telling you, because now all of a sudden he's channeling his inner Jeremiah here. He's like, I'm telling you, I'm sick and tired of you people doing the wrong thing. Yeah, worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and springs of water. Then we get another angel that arrives on the scene and says, Babylon has fallen. Whenever we hear Babylon, who should we automatically think of? Rome. It's just the Romans. Why? Because who were the Babylonians in the long story of the people of God? The people who destroyed Jerusalem and took everybody into exile. Okay, again, this is not hard. This is not particularly complicated. Then the third angel tells everyone that those who worship the beast and receive the beast's mark will drink the wine of God's wrath. And now they were just singing, blue, wow. That's some grim imagery, and we need to remember, we need to take a step back. And again, like the whole language with the virgins and following the Lamb, we have to read this in the way that John intended it, right? This is symbolic language, and it feels vindictive and terrorizing. It feels exactly like the old turn or burn sermons of the Great Awakenings, and probably far too many churches even now that essentially say that in the great sermon from the Great Awakening, it was called In the Hands of an Angry God. That was the name of the sermon, and that gives you a sense. And he spins out this lovely image that Christians are like a spider hanging on one thread over the entire pit of hell, and that if you don't turn your life around, the flames of hell will consume you forever. But I want to sort out this imagery. And John isn't all of a sudden again going to ask us to be taking these things literally, right? There's no cup and there's no wrath in it. John's been using symbols and metaphors throughout the book, and it's just not consistent that all of a sudden he's going to say, okay, I don't want you to take these things symbolically, I want you to take them literally. He's not going to do that. So we remain in the world of symbols. John's been making the prophetic point that those who persist in living contrary to God's will, to the way that God made the universe, the way that God called us to be, they're going to suffer. If you keep following the wrong path, bad things will happen. If you keep following the road of violence and warfare, you can't be surprised that people are going to attack you using violence and warfare. If you try to bring people to peace through oppression, you can't be surprised when oppression is used, right? And so he's reminding people that if you don't follow God, you can't be surprised when things go sideways. And that's a very Old Testament kind of prophetic notion that follow God and things aren't going to be perfect, but they're going to be better than the way they are right now. And so John is saying, if you keep following after the other gods, yeah, you're going to suffer. You're going to suffer precisely because you're not following the path that God laid out for all of us. And John is going to essentially say, you don't have to, it's not about fire and brimstone or sulfur and all this other kind of stuff. Those are images to depict that this is going to not be good. This is going to be bad. And the worst thing about it is that you're going to be separated from God, and you're going to have done that to yourself, right? God's not running away from you. You're running away from God. You keep running away from God, you can't turn around and say, where's God? Well, in your rearview mirror, where you put him. And interestingly enough, in C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters, which is one of my it's a great fictional way of trying to get at some of, good Christian theology. C.S. Lewis has his senior tempter, a devil named Screwtape, say that, trying to remind his idiot nephew that God doesn't ravish, God woos, right? God's not going to track you down and force you to love him. God wants you to love him, and so he's going to show you the way. God created us with free will, right? We have the choice. We can choose the good or the bad, and God's always going to respect that free will. And this is where we get ourselves into trouble, because what we're really thinking is, do we really want God as a puppet master with us as marionettes on strings? And we're like, no, not really. We want free will. Okay, well, that means that you've got to choose to do good, right? God's going to give us a path. God's going to give us a shepherd to show us how to walk that path, how to do it, how to not fall off. But God's not going to force us to do it. God's not going to force us to do the right thing. God's not going to force us to turn towards him. So, torment by fire and sulfur, no rest day or night for those who worship the beast. This is nothing less than a realization that hell is self-inflicted. Hell is self-imposed. Hell is self-perpetuated. We go down that road all on our own, and we run away from God. And if we turn around and say, where's God? God's like, well, I'm trying to chase after you. But you got to, Christ will seek us out. But if we're the ones who keep running away, we keep rejecting God, we keep doing all the wrong things, well, guess what? Bad things will follow. As night follows day, He's never far away. He's not. But if we keep rejecting, if we keep turning away, if we, every single time, God reaches out to us and we're slapping the hand, it doesn't mean that God gives up, but it does mean that we're still not with God, And we did that. That's what hell is, It's separation from God. But we are the ones who separated ourselves, And then finally, at the end of chapter 14, the language of torment to suffering is followed by another moment of comfort. Blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. And then we get the final judgment, the gathering of the field and arbor, harvest and vintage. And again, you're thinking, okay, here we go. We've hit the last judgment again, and we're all done, right? No. I mean, yes, but no, because John's now going to unpack this scene just in a different way. But remember, he's done this before. He keeps looping back around. He keeps going, okay, we're going to go this far, and now we're going to peel back, and I'm going to tell it to you in a different way, because he needs to double back to add detail, to add depth. he's going to constantly reinforcing by upping the stakes. And so next week, we get chapters 15 through 18. And these are the pouring out of the 7 bowls, right? Which again is going to be a whole lot of bad things happening. But it's not new bad things happening. It's just like the breaking of the seals and the blowing of the 7 trumpets. These are the plagues, but now they're going to be described differently. But he's going to take, if the 7 seals were not great, and then the 7 trumpets were worse, the bowls are even going to be more so. And he's doing this, though. It's the same stuff, but he's still trying to get your attention. Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, that's exactly it, Jackie. Let me put it to you in a way that you are not going to miss this time, because he's still making the same points. And this repetition isn't a problem because he's so creative, right? It's so well written that we're like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? We're engaged in the story, and that's where John wants us to be. Because maybe if we're engaged, maybe if we're really paying attention, maybe if we're just, I have no idea how this is going to end, although he's told us how it's going to end 2 or 3 times by now. We know the end of this story, but we're still engaged. That's good writing. That's because then maybe we'll take away those 2 or 3 things that John needs us to understand. And that sets us up nicely for next week. And so next week, 7 bowls. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. My hope is that as we continue to do this, you do have a few tools at your disposal when you go back and reread this again at some point. And that you understand that it is symbolic, it's highly poetic, it's highly visionary, sometimes it's hard to grasp, but that John's giving us the clues. And John's giving us the tools that we need to understand it and then take hope away from it. And that's really the whole point of doing this Bible study, is to take the book of Revelation back from all those people who have used it just to scare or just to really wildly misinterpret who Jesus is and who God is. I think a lot of the people who, if we're to use John's language, who have the mark of the beast, well, it's these interpreters. Because all they're doing is using fear and violence and warfare and bloodshed. They're using Satan's tools instead of understanding that John's saying, oh, that's the worst thing that you could possibly do. And so we want to take it back, right? I want to reclaim the book of Revelation for us and for all people, right? Because it's been used too long as a weapon when it should be something that opens us up. Because that's what Revelation means, right? To be opened. John wants us to be open, but open to God. So I hope that's what we're doing. It's good stuff. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, everybody. We will see you next Wednesday at 12:15 for the 7 bowls. So go ahead and read it, and then we'll sort it out. But my guess is that by next week, you're going to be like, oh, I don't need that pastor at all. I know what I'm doing now. All right, we'll see you next week.